The morning sea fog rose from the direction of the Black Sea and crept slowly along the limestone slopes outside Sevastopol, climbing with a measured, patient motion. Before the front line had fully awakened, the mist laid a damp grey light over every contour. The air held the metallic tang of the night's bombardment. From the low ground came the smell of torn-up earth. Farther off lingered the faint, acrid trace of fuel smoke, not yet dispersed. On a piece of prepared high ground, the German reconnaissance platoon had laid out its forward observation positions. Wooden stakes, sandbags, and earth walls stood in strict alignment, stiff and regular, like elements in a template drawn in advance by engineers. Days of shelling had gnawed away at these shapes, blunting corners and tearing edges, yet at the moment when daylight returned, they still clung to the forms that had been prescribed for them. Erwin Kaltenhof's day began in that light. His back was straight, his movements steady and unhurried, like the swing of a metronome perfectly in time. He took up his field glasses first, wiping the edges of the lenses with the corner of his sleeve. Then he raised them to his face and turned the focus wheel with precise fingers, adjusting until the etched reticle lines overlapped perfectly with the dark outline of the distant ridge. His face showed no extra expression. There was no visible tension, no sign of doubt. From the way he handled the instrument, it was possible to glimpse a logic that did not belong to the battlefield's noise at all. Every movement matched an item in a mental checklist. Every step of action adhered tightly to a procedure that had been fixed long ago. He checked the chart on his clipboard, smoothing the grid with his thumb to confirm the paper was dry and unblemished. He examined the pencil tip to ensure it was sharpened to a length within his personal range of control. Only then did he write the date and the day's serial number at the top. His handwriting was narrow and sharp, as if engraved in a metal surface. Around him, the other soldiers worked through their assigned duties. When tasks were finished, some would occasionally look up, tracking the brown and black columns of smoke rising along the horizon, or exchange a quick, wordless glance with a comrade. Erwin did not. He stood at his marked point, turned the azimuth dial, and swept the glass across each sector in its prescribed order: trench line, scrub and bushes, the shattered farmhouse, the dark patches that marked Soviet forward positions. He held each angle for a measured number of seconds. The length of each pause remained the same, as if controlled by an invisible clock. He sorted his observations by type as he wrote. Suspicious movement was recorded as symbols. Artillery impacts were marked with numbers. Distant dust plumes were traced as faint lines indicating direction of travel. The entries on the page fell into a quiet, rigid order, indifferent to whether the battlefield itself was orderly or not. There was nothing dramatic in this part of his day, but the tension in it was unmistakable. He was not simply watching the battle. He was maintaining a crucial node in a larger system. His silence and concentration made him seem less a man than a device, something designed to function as long as the procedure allowed. As the sun climbed higher, the fog drained back into the valleys, and more detail emerged in the distance. Steep rock faces, peeled back layers of soil, deep shell craters, fallen boards, and splintered planks. Soviet artillery usually grew more active toward midday. Erwin did not react in any emotional way. When his observation cycle moved into the next interval, he merely shifted his hand to the edge of his chart, ready to record. Several rounds landed somewhere ahead with a dull, heavy impact. He adjusted the angle of his field glasses by a small degree, checking whether the salvo was walking closer to the German front. If the distances and bearings did not change significantly, he drew a faint horizontal stroke across the row concerned, his mark for no new developments. This pattern had continued, almost unchanged, for months. He had never stepped beyond his defined role. He had never added an extra step not required by the procedure. The rules laid out his boundaries. He filled them with precision. His sense of value had become lodged in those small elements, the marks on his scales, the boxes on his charts, the fixed bearings on his compass. On this day, the stability broke. The late morning barrage came heavier than before. At first, there were only isolated shocks, like blows the earth could absorb with a single shudder. Then the impacts came in runs, the sound rolling back through the valleys in waves, like metal sheets slamming together. Sandbags were lifted and thrown. Wooden posts shivered. Loosened stones clattered down the slope. A thick curtain of dust climbed and spread, and for a time the forward positions disappeared behind it. Erwin continued to write. He moved his gaze along the set angles, trying to pierce the dust and locate the fall of shot. But the barrage thickened. The far horizon seemed to be repeatedly torn apart and remade, sections of ground sinking, leaping up in clouds of soil and stone, then collapsing again. Suddenly the view through the lenses showed shapes that did not belong. A line of sandbags lifted as a whole and vanished. A timber platform broke into several jagged sections. Telephone wires whipped loose and hung in the air like torn cords. He stopped. It was not hesitation. It was the brief, deliberate pause of someone confirming a fact. The observation point on which his procedure rested had been destroyed. Regulations required him to remain at his assigned station and keep observing. At his feet, the markers that defined that station were gone. Numbered stakes had been blasted away. Windbreak canvas lay on the ground in charred strips. The line he was supposed to hold existed now only as a broken slope. He did not immediately fall back. He did not immediately appeal to any authority. He took a single step forward and set his field glasses on a stone that still held its shape. The stone lay only a short distance beyond the official limit, but it was clearly outside what the rules named as his position. The procedure did not allow this. He chose to do it anyway. Until that moment, he had never permitted himself a deviation of even a meter. He resumed his work. He recorded the height, spread, and direction of the smoke columns, the interval between salvos, signs that Soviet batteries were shifting their range, fresh collapses along the infantry trenches. He arranged the scattered data like fragments of bone, aligning them in an attempt to reconstruct a larger picture that had already gone. On the chart, beside the main grid, a small annotation appeared. His first non-standard symbol. A makeshift arrow denoting an alternative vantage point in the absence of designated observation posts. It was a minor breach. From outside, almost no one would have seen it. For Erwin, it marked a break. For the first time, he acknowledged that the physical base of the system he served had vanished, while he still tried to keep its form moving. He did not show worry or excitement. His motions stayed level and calm. But for the first time, the battlefield had forced him to take an action not listed in any manual. He complied, as always, in the most restrained manner possible. The barrage went on. The observation zone was torn up, but lines continued to appear on his pages. As the dust thinned, a new landscape revealed itself. The chain of observation positions that had once been continuous now existed only as scattered fragments, like the remnants of a ridge washed down by long rain. Half a telephone pole stuck from the ground. Numbered stakes were burned to black stumps. Scraps of forms and notes lay among the churned soil. On the map, the observation line looked straight and clean. In reality, it had become a collection of ruined points that no longer formed any discernible line at all. He folded his glasses and his chart, placed both in his clipboard, and stood for a moment among the wreckage, looking out across the broken ground. He knew what the book required of him. He should go to the rear and make a report. But the telephone network to the rear was gone. Even if he reached an aid point, the data would not travel further. The orders said he should hold here. There was nothing left to hold. For the first time, the procedure could not point him even roughly toward what came next. And for a moment, he did not step in to answer that question himself. He stood still, as if he and the battlefield had arrived at the same pause. Under his boots, the ground was a loose mix of dust and stone. The shapes he knew had collapsed. Every tool he carried still pointed to a reference that no longer existed. He remained standing inside that absence, as if waiting for an order he now understood would not arrive. Only when another thought formed did he move. If no one redefined the observation points, the forward troops would lose their sight of the battlefield entirely. He stopped waiting. He pushed the clipboard under his tunic, stepped over what had once been a stake, and was now only grey powder, and walked forward. This time, he went more than a meter. He removed himself completely from his former position. Fog swallowed his figure as he moved into the half-collapsed ground. The broken observation line behind him no longer had any hold over where he stood or what he could see. For the first time, he placed himself outside the written system in order to keep some part of that system functioning. It was a small beginning, almost invisible from afar, but it changed his place on the battlefield. By afternoon, the shelling eased, like a machine running low on power. Broken stone, dust, and torn wood lay scattered along the slopes with no pattern other than that of force and fall. The line still vibrated, but the motion now came from people and vehicles, not impacts. The structure of observation posts had been smashed, its straight line broken into separate fragments. Erwin moved among them, not because a new order had been given, but because there were no orders left to follow. He climbed the broken ramp that once led to the second observation point. The position had been repeatedly shaped and reinforced in earlier weeks, cut into a stable platform with clear angles of fire. Now it was only a crater, walls ridged by blast, half a charred stake embedded in the layers of soil, sandbag remnants clinging to the edges like torn cloth. He paused at the rim, then lowered himself down carefully, toes feeling for stable footholds. At the bottom, he opened his chart again and propped his field glasses on a shelf of rock. The Soviet line, altered by the bombardments, showed new patterns. Tracks where artillery had pulled back. Deep wheel ruts pressed into the roads. Fresh dark points where machine gun nests had revealed themselves as the dust cleared. He recorded them, bearings and distances, with the same speed he had applied before. The data had no clear destination now. He wrote anyway. By the time he left the crater, the sky already held a yellow stain from smoke. He moved on to another piece of broken high ground, once the site of the third observation post. Now it was only a torn slope, the top broken into jagged pieces. Kneeling among the stones, he studied the terrain and combined what had been the second and third sectors into one partial field of view. On the chart, he drew a heavier line and marked it as a substitute sector. It did not exist in any manual. The sheet itself, though, still held a clean, systematic structure. No one had told him to do this. No one watched him. He simply continued along the line of the procedure until the line itself broke off. His own movement carried on beyond that break. It was like a machine with one part removed, the remaining parts continuing to turn because their motion had not yet run down. He had stepped beyond the written orders. His actions still followed their internal logic. In the days that followed, the front sagged steadily backward. The contours of the line eroded like sand under a recurring tide. Retreat, collapse, retreat again. The telephone network never came back. Each unit, battalion, company, platoon, constructed its picture of events from whatever happened to reach it. A runner back from the line, a sighting from a hill, a rumor carried down a trench. In that confusion, Erwin's sphere of action widened, not through any conscious ambition, but because each gap in the structure demanded that someone stand in it. For a time, he moved between two isolated points of high ground like the swing of a pendulum. The rocks gave limited cover. He had to balance exposure against the need to see. From behind one rock, he would raise his glasses, take a brief look to mark changes in Soviet gun positions or bursts of machine gun fire, then move at once to another patch of shelter. He stitched the scattered glimpses together into lines of ink, new diagrams of the enemy's fire. The edges of these diagrams were thick with alterations, smudges, overwritten segments, arrows extended, timestamps written twice and crossed through. Each change represented another place where the line had faltered and where he had tried to redraw it. Occasionally, broken squads passed below the ridge, men covered in dust from helmet to boot, straps hanging loose, their formation lost. They looked for anything that might still hold steady. Erwin was such a point. He did not call out. When they came close enough, he handed them quick sketches or pointed with brief words to safer routes and likely traps. His voice remained quiet, almost matter-of-fact, like a technician explaining how to operate a piece of equipment. The men who listened rarely had time to think. They reacted and moved. Often the paths he gave them proved more useful than orders shouted out in haste by officers who had lost sight of the whole situation. None of this turned him into a hero. He did not assume command, did not lead charges, did not make himself a symbol. He did what he had always done. He tried to make routes executable. The scope of his work grew beyond his formal rank. The intention did not change. His charts were passed among different company headquarters, unfolded, folded, handled until sweat blurred the lines. Still they functioned. They helped small groups avoid several encirclements that were closing fast. As the strain accumulated, small discrepancies began to appear in his work. At first they were minor. His estimates of Soviet advance times slipped by a few minutes. Later, he misjudged a road's capacity and marked it as usable when it was nearly impassable. A group of men had to turn back from a low-lying area that he had thought they could cross. Nothing catastrophic followed those mistakes, but they opened thin cracks in his own sense of accuracy. When he found an error, he returned to correct it, trying to bring his figures back into line with reality. Lack of sleep, constant exposure, and too little food shifted his work away from calculation. He relied more on intuition than on numbers. One evening, on his way back from a forward rise, a loose rock turned under his boot. He slid down a slope. A jagged stone tore open his leg. He pressed his hand against the wound and kept moving. He climbed until he could see the forward line again and tried to adjust his sketch. The wind shook the edges of the paper. His bloodless fingers could barely hold the pencil. His lines trembled. The new charts showed more and more evidence of confusion. Times repeated. Arrows contradicted one another. Numbers overlapped. He tried to unify them again. There was too much to fit. Fatigue blurred the difference between yesterday's marks and today's. When the pencil snapped, he picked up a burned splinter of wood and continued to drag it across the paper, leaving dark smears rather than clear lines. That unfinished map became his last piece of work. Halfway through, he saw that he could not go on. Dark spots gathered at the edge of his vision. His breath lost its rhythm. His body stopped responding. He tried to stand and instead slumped against the rim of a shell hole. The terrain around him no longer arranged itself into any map he could read. He heard the sounds of battle, the distant hits, the shouts, the clatter, but their meaning no longer formed in his mind. For the first time, he could not carry out any task at all. Retreating soldiers moved along the slope above him, boots sending up clouds of dust. Someone glanced down briefly, took in his condition. Bleeding, exhausted, unable to move unaided, not wounded enough to count as urgent. It would take 2 men to carry him. The unit was already in motion. After a brief, silent calculation, they went on. They flowed around him like water around a stone. He was left there. As the shelling faded, warmth leaked out of the soil. He rested against the sloping edge of the crater, the unfinished chart lying beside him. The lines he had drawn could no longer guide anyone. In that moment, he lost the only framework that had given his life shape. Function. Through the night, the shelling thinned and stopped. Smoke settled. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Time disappeared. At dawn, he heard engines. A medical truck, its sides covered with faded canvas, ground up along the slope. The tires grated on the stones. 2 stretcher-bearers jumped down, scanning the area. They had come to gather casualties left along the route. Not for him specifically. When they found him, they did not appear surprised. His state was clear enough, not dying, not able to walk back. They examined him briefly, then lifted him onto a stretcher. They did their work quickly and without conversation. He was placed in the rear of the truck among men who lay unconscious or groaning. When the truck started, his body swayed slightly with each bump. The sky edged into view through gaps in the canvas, divided into strips by the ribs of the frame. The truck ran back and forth between the front and the rear, stopping at aid posts where some wounded were passed on. Erwin was eventually carried into a makeshift dressing station and placed in a corner. A doctor cleaned and bandaged his leg and handed him a small ration of bread. He was registered as combat ineffective but not an emergency. It was a category that did not call attention to itself. From there, he was moved with other rear area personnel and wounded men as the front withdrew westward. His wound closed, but his strength and response time did not return to what they had been. He could walk, but could not be used near the front. He was marked as mobile but unsuitable for reconnaissance, and assigned to a new unit. He still wore his rank. His duties changed entirely. He now copied and organized charts drawn by others. His handwriting remained precise, but the chain from his pencil to the actual battlefield had thinned to a thread. It was as if he were imitating a routine he had once executed fully. As operations shifted west, even that reduced structure loosened. Supplies failed. Orders contradicting other orders arrived late or not at all. Retreat moved faster than reconnaissance could keep up. Erwin fell further behind whatever was happening. His body kept step with the march. His mind did not. He no longer tried to understand the wider situation. He walked because the column walked. In effect, he shifted from being a part of the procedure to being carried by it. An air raid broke even that. Bombers dropped delayed action bombs along the road. Vehicles flipped and burned. Smoke and fuel mixed into a thick haze. The column fragmented, scattering into fields and ditches. No one reformed a line. He was pushed off the road and into a muddy hole. By the time he climbed out, his unit was gone. He did not know which direction to follow. He no longer had the strength to try. For the second time, the structure he belonged to moved on without him. When the noise of aircraft faded, the ground was marked with scattered fires and the black shells of trucks. He walked slowly along a ditch until nightfall. Sometime in the dark, he heard the tracks of tanks, the heavy drag of metal over soil. American forces were advancing. Hours later, their reconnaissance vehicles passed along the road. Infantry followed, fanning out in search. Scattered German soldiers were gathered quickly and formed into groups under shouted orders and fixed bayonets. Erwin was pushed into one such group. The act of surrender came without drama. By that stage, both sides had a procedure for managing large batches of prisoners. The captured men were ordered to put down their weapons and throw away their packs, keeping only their canteens and basic clothing. The formations were divided into smaller groups to be marched to assembly points. Erwin walked unsteadily. Sometimes he steadied himself with a hand on the shoulder of the man ahead. His gaze was slow, as if some part of him still remained among the shattered positions behind them. They were brought to a cleared farmyard where several American trucks stood waiting. 3 broad lines had been marked on the ground: registration, medical check, grouping. At each stage, a small detail of medical personnel and military police worked in silence, maintaining a slow, constant flow. Erwin moved forward with the column. At the medical line, a corporal in a medic's armband stood behind a folding table. On it lay a stethoscope, a water bottle, pre-printed forms, and a short pencil. The corporal examined each prisoner in seconds. His eyes did not look for identity. They looked for categories: heavy wounds, light wounds, infections, exhaustion, conditions needing immediate care. Each observation matched a box on the paper. Each box dictated the next step. When Erwin reached him, he swayed slightly on his feet. He did not look gravely wounded, but long-term strain and exhaustion showed plainly in his gait and in his delayed responses. The corporal told him to stand straight, ran his hands quickly from chest to shoulders, then tilted his chin up to inspect his pupils. In a few moments, he bent over the form and wrote a brief note in one line. It was a standard phrase: priority assessment, sheltered placement. The guards acted according to that mark. They pulled Erwin from the line and took him to a half-collapsed shed, set somewhat apart. The floor was covered in dry straw. Burn marks blackened the boards, but the walls and roof gave shelter from wind and rain. They settled him in the shade, checked that he could remain sitting, then returned to their work. The action was unremarkable, easy to overlook. It was not an act of personal care. It was the result of a system meant to prevent avoidable deaths during transfer. Hundreds of prisoners passed through the same intake. The same marks were written, the same adjustments made. For Erwin, the meaning was sharper. Twice his own army's structure had let him fall when he no longer fit its needs. Here, in the enemy's structure, one checked box gave him a place again. It was not compassion. It was not recognition. It was a process filtering and sorting, and in that filtering he was shifted from danger into protection. He was later moved to a larger prisoner-of-war camp. Barbed wire enclosed the compound. Straight roads divided it into sections. Bread, water, and soup were distributed at fixed times. Roll calls, cleaning duties, and short announcements followed an orderly schedule. Contact between guards and prisoners was limited mostly to commands and brief responses, more action than speech. Within that pattern, his strength slowly returned. His movements, though slow, grew steadier. As he recovered, some old habits returned. He watched the lines at the water taps, the routes used by cleaning details, the places where refuse tended to pile up. He noted the rhythm of food distribution. the hours when queues lengthened and when they disappeared. With cardboard and a broken pencil, he drew a simple plan of the camp, marking the latrines, storage sheds, and medical tent. The sketches were not meant as tools for revolt or escape. They restored, in small form, something he recognized: order. The medical staff noticed his grasp of layout and asked him at times to record where the wounded were kept or how supplies were arranged. His drawings were pinned inside the medical tent and used when planning daily tasks. He no longer served any army, yet again he became part of a system that needed orientation. His role changed. He was no longer a soldier executing field orders, nor a node in a network of observers. He was simply someone who could make a space understandable. At night, he sometimes thought of the observation posts in Crimea. There, he had maintained battlefield order by adhering to procedure. Here, he maintained a quieter order, where survival was the goal. Between those places lay different lines, different languages, different uniforms. Yet when he thought of how people and resources were positioned, he sensed a strange similarity. For the first time, he understood that what granted him a place was neither loyalty nor any moral notion of worth. It was the needs of the systems that surrounded him. When they needed him, they took him in. When they did not, they moved on without him. All along, he had adjusted himself to their requirements. The days in the camp followed one another with the still swing of a pendulum. Roll call, distribution, quiet hours, duties. In that repetition, he accepted a final fact. In Crimea, he had overstepped his formal limits to cover the holes in his own side's system, and that system had left him behind. Here, having lost all defined function, he was still protected by another. The moment when the Americans saved him had never really been a personal drama. It belonged to the space between two structures, to the way one classification replaced another. He had believed he existed inside orders. In truth, he had survived inside categories. Winter winds cut through the camp with a sharpened edge, shaped by their passage between wire and posts. At night, the canvas roofs of the barracks billowed and fell with each gust, making a low, regular sound. Erwin often woke to that sound. He did not panic. He looked around and confirmed that he lay in a space that pointed nowhere, defined only by its boundaries. He had grown used to this kind of stability. It was unlike the brittle order at the front, always threatened by collapse. Morning roll calls were brief. Standing in the ranks, he no longer translated terrain, bearings, and distances into maps in his mind. He stood as one number among others. He did not resist this, and he did not depend on it. He existed alongside it. When the formation broke, he walked the camp's main road, quietly checking things no one had asked him to check, whether a toppled crate had been cleared away, whether the water barrels by the medical tent were full, whether the track to the kitchen had been cut deeper by cartwheels. His steps had the same deliberate care as before, but their purpose was lighter. Once, a step might have changed a diagram of fire. Now, nothing he did shaped a larger structure. Perhaps because of this, his actions felt freer. Beyond the northern fence lay a field, the snow over it rising and falling in gentle swells. There were no trenches there, no craters, no burn marks. In the hours before roll call or at dusk, he sometimes went to stand in the fence's shadow, watching the wind blow the thin snow into shifting lines and patches. The patterns resembled incomplete survey lines. There was nothing to measure. He looked anyway, as if learning to see a kind of order that existed without rules. The notice board had once been his regular stopping point. His sketches were pinned there, showing stores, paths, and the medical area. He was not responsible for them formally. He did not need them to prove anything about himself. They were simply used until they were worn and outdated. After a stormy night, he found the board fallen in the mud, the papers soaked and dissolved into blurred shapes. He lifted the remnants away and did not redraw them. The quiet of that choice marked a turning point. For the first time, he allowed a form of order to continue without him. Later, he was often assigned near the wounded area, where the air smelled of disinfectant and damp cloth, and the cold turned breath into pale cloud. He no longer tracked troop movements. He merely adjusted the spacing of cots, shifted water closer to where it was needed, cut arrows from cardboard to guide the medical staff through crowded spaces. These actions drew little notice. Yet the ward grew less crowded. Waiting lines shortened. The confusion around supplies eased. No one attributed this to him. No one asked who had made the changes, but everyone benefited in some small way. On the day new prisoners arrived under heavy snow, they came into the camp with the raw vigilance of men fresh from the line. Their clothes carried mud and the scent of explosives. Erwin was sent to guide them. He did not speak much. He raised a hand to indicate where to stand, how to line up. Some men, their eyes unfocused, followed the movement of his arm and settled into place. He was like a fixed stone amid a turbulent stream. The current flowed around him, and in doing so, found a direction. At night, he returns to his bunk, leaned against the wood, and listened to the wind move the canvas overhead. By his bed was a small box with pencil stubs and folded cardboard. He no longer turned them into maps. He arranged them simply, giving them a neat, ordered place. In this life, without collapse or triumph, without spectacle, he found, for the first time, a space in which his existence felt sufficient. Not saved, not embraced, permitted. Permitted to go on without being tied to a function or a written rule. Before spring, the camp authorities updated the registers. His name remained, without note of special assignment or transfer. The absence of annotation brought neither relief nor disappointment. It was like a carefully measured blank, allowing him to remain where he was without being called to account. One day, as the snow along the camp road began to melt, water gathered and then ran in thin threads along the grain of the soil, seeking lower ground. He stopped and watched a small stream draw itself across the earth. It had no marked beginning, no named end. It followed only the shape of the land. The line it traced was crooked and irregular and complete. He let out a slow breath. Some paths, he understood, do not depend on intention or on procedure. They appear when fixed points are gone, and the remaining shape of the world guides them. He was walking along such a path now.